Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. It was an evening like any other. My son Elijah was upstairs, focused on his schoolwork, while I sat downstairs at the dinner table with my wife Peggy, whom I had been married to for 8 years. The air between us was thick with an unsettling quiet. We weren't exchanging pleasantries, nor were we engaged in any meaningful conversation. Instead, she merely prodded at her food, her fork absently moving pieces around her plate. Her eyes, unfocused and distant, were locked onto some invisible point beyond the table. At first I brushed it off, assuming she was simply worn out from the day or lost in thought. But something about her demeanor felt off, more than just exhaustion. She was avoiding my gaze, deliberately so. A tension I couldn't quite name lingered in the silence, and eventually, I broke it. "Are you okay?" I asked. She paused, her fork halting midair. Then, after a long moment, she lifted her head and met my eyes. The words that followed shattered everything I thought I knew. "I think we should try an open marriage." For a second, I was certain I had misheard her. The words didn't seem to register, their meaning slipping through my grasp. "What?" She remained composed, leaning back in her chair and folding her arms. There was no laughter, no nervous hesitation. "I think we should have the freedom to explore. It could actually make our relationship stronger." Stronger? My mind struggled to keep up. The world around me seemed to slow to a crawl, yet my thoughts raced, colliding in a frantic mess. She wasn't uncertain. She wasn't testing the waters. She had already made up her mind. That realization was more frightening than anything else. A million questions rushed to the surface. Was there already someone else? Had I been blind to what was happening? Had she simply decided that I was the last to know? I could have erupted, demanded answers, accused her of betrayal. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, letting the weight of her words settle in the space between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was firm. "That's not the marriage I agreed to." I held her stare, making sure she understood the gravity of my words. "If you're done with this, just say it." She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. Instead, she offered a slight shrug. "I figured you'd say that." Without another word, she rose, picked up her plate, and walked away. No argument, no attempt at discussion. It was clear, this wasn't a conversation. She wasn't seeking my approval or asking for my input. This was a choice she had already made, and soon enough, I would understand exactly why. Peggy had been watching someone else, a friend who had done the same thing, a woman who had convinced her husband to open their marriage while still holding on to the security of a stable home, his financial support, and the comfortable life she was used to. Peggy had been taking notes, imagining herself in that scenario. She wanted both, the steady foundation of a husband and the thrill of other men. And the worst part? She truly believed I would go along with it. The next morning, an unnatural quiet filled the house. There was no casual "good morning" from Peggy, no acknowledgement of my presence at all. Just an empty silence that hadn't existed before. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was already there, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, scrolling absent-mindedly. She didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge me in the slightest. I stood for a moment, waiting for some sign of recognition. A glance, a nod, anything. But she gave me nothing. Even on our worst days, we had always exchanged a small farewell before heading off for the day. Not this time. When I finally murmured a simple "morning," she didn't even look up. She just took a sip of coffee and kept scrolling. At work, I caught myself checking my phone repeatedly, half expecting some sort of message from her, a routine check-in, a casual text. But there was nothing. No questions about my day, no acknowledgement of my existence. It was as though I had already been erased from her world. By the time dinner rolled around, the rift between us had grown wider, becoming almost palpable. We sat at the same table, yet it felt as though a vast distance separated us. I tried to reach out, to find a way back, but her responses were hollow, devoid of warmth or interest. Okay. Yeah. That was all she offered. The woman I had loved for nearly a decade now looked at me as if I were nothing more than a stranger. And what made it unbearable was that she didn't seem to care. In the days that followed, the distance turned to something even colder. Peggy stopped pretending altogether. When she wasn't outright ignoring me, she was dismissing me with casual indifference. She'd sit next to me on the couch, phone in hand, smiling at messages she didn't bother to hide. Her fingers flew across the screen with a kind of excitement I hadn't seen from her in years. One night, I finally asked, "Who are you talking to?" She rolled her eyes, barely looking up. "No one. No one." Right. She began going out more often, dressing up like she was single, expensive outfits, flawless makeup, hair styled to perfection. If I asked where she was going, her answers were always vague. "Out with friends," she'd say, slipping into her heels. And if I pressed further, she'd sigh, grab her purse and mutter, "Why do you care?" before vanishing through the door. Some nights she didn't return at all. No texts, no calls, no explanations. And when she did come home, she'd head straight to the shower before crawling into bed, acting as if nothing had happened. I could smell the alcohol on her, but I kept my mouth shut, already knowing how the conversation would go. If I confronted her, she'd just laugh, roll her eyes, and tell me I was paranoid. Then came the night I finally snapped. She walked in, hair tousled, the scent of perfume and liquor lingering in the air around her. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Peggy, we need to talk." She glanced up, amusement flickering in her eyes, then let out a short laugh. "No, we don't," she said, brushing past me without a second thought. And that was the moment I knew. Whatever we had built, whatever love had once existed between us, it was already gone. She walked into the bedroom and, without a glance or a word, closed the door behind her, leaving me standing there. In that instant, I realized this wasn't a case of her not caring. It was intentional. She was trying to make me feel insignificant, as if I didn't matter at all. It's one thing to sense that your spouse might no longer have any affection for you. It's something entirely different when your child starts to notice it too. One evening, as I was clearing the dishes, Elijah looked up at me, his big eyes filled with confusion. "Dad, why doesn't Peggy eat with us anymore?" For a moment, I froze. How could I possibly explain to an 11-year-old that the woman he thought of as family had stopped making any effort to be present in our lives? How could I tell him that she deliberately chose to avoid us? I forced a smile, ruffling his hair to hide my own discomfort. "She's just been really busy, buddy." He didn't push me further, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Later that night, after Elijah had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the dim light casting shadows around me. I felt like a phantom in my own house, slowly fading away, while Peggy acted as if I didn't even exist. The tipping point came in the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m. I was stirred from sleep by a soft laugh. At first I was disoriented. Then I turned my head. There she was, beside me in bed, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She was smiling, texting someone, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the screen. I stayed quiet, watching. Maybe she thought I was still asleep. Or maybe she just didn't care if I was awake. Something inside me snapped. Until that moment, I had tried to convince myself that her behavior was just a phase, that maybe things would turn around. But seeing her, fully immersed in someone else while lying right next to me, made one thing undeniable. She wasn't coming back. And even worse, She thought I would just stay and accept it. But not anymore. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I made up my mind. I wouldn't just walk out. I would do it on my own terms. I began documenting everything. Every late night with no explanation, every dismissive response when I asked where she had been, every time she met my questions with a sharp, "Why do you care?" Then, the opportunity presented itself. Peggy left her phone unattended for a few minutes. I seized the chance, picked it up, and opened her messages. I took screenshots of every flirtatious exchange she'd had with other men, sending them to myself to make sure I had proof. Proof that I could hold on to, should she try to twist the story when I walked away. Next, I contacted a lawyer. I needed to be sure of my rights and options, and I wanted everything in place before I left. This wasn't just about walking away, it was about making sure she couldn't control the narrative once I was gone. Then, I took another step. I reached out to my boss. For a while, I'd been toying with the idea of transferring to another state, but I had held back, not wanting to leave Peggy behind. But now, that hesitation was gone. My boss quickly approved the transfer. The final piece of the puzzle was securing an apartment in the new city. Once that was done, everything was set. A new beginning was waiting for me. I just had to find the right moment. Leaving wasn't something I could rush. I needed to be strategic, patient, and observe. What I saw only made my decision clearer. Peggy had stopped pretending. Her indifference and contempt were no longer hidden. She came and went as she pleased, treating me like an annoyance whenever I dared to ask where she had been. And Elijah? She barely acknowledged him, as though he was nothing more than an inconvenience. Even though he wasn't her biological child, she had once claimed to love him. Now, she acted as if he didn't matter. That's when I knew. It was time to go. The morning I left, Peggy probably slept in, unaware of the changes I had already set in motion. She had no reason to suspect anything was different. But soon, the silence would catch her attention. The emptiness of the house would begin to sink in. As she moved through the rooms, small details would begin to stand out. Eventually, she would make her way to the kitchen for her coffee. That's where she would find the final clue. An envelope on the counter, right next to the coffee maker. Inside, divorce papers. And on top of it, a small sticky note with just a few words, written in my handwriting. I hope you find the freedom you wanted. I could only imagine her reaction, but honestly, I didn't care. After I left, she never called. Not once. No fake concern, no attempt to reach out or pretend that she missed me. If there was any regret, it wasn't enough for her to pick up the phone, and that told me everything I needed to know. The first time I heard from her again, it wasn't through a call or a message. It came in the form of a letter from her lawyer, a cold, detached piece of paper, only distinguished by her name scrawled at the bottom. What did she want? Money. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a demand for financial compensation. There was no sign of any desire to reconcile, no attempt to mend the damage done. Peggy had never cared about Elijah, and she never had. Being a mother was a role she had never truly taken on. When I left, there wasn't even the pretense of wanting custody. That didn't concern her. What mattered to her was a financial settlement. The lawyer's letter detailed the terms like it was a standard business deal. An amount to cover the marriage, spousal support, even though she was fully capable of standing on her own, and, most infuriating of all, half of my assets. As if, after everything, I still owed her that. The gall of it was almost laughable. Fairness wasn't what she was after. She wanted a reward for all the years she spent treating me like a secondary thought. But I wasn't about to let that slide. By the time I walked into the courtroom, I was ready. Months of gathering evidence had prepared me for this. I had documented her indifference, the long hours she spent away, and even saved conversations showing that she had emotionally checked out long before she suggested opening up the marriage. When my lawyer presented everything, the case was over before it began. The judge didn't even need to deliberate for long. The decision was quick. Peggy would get nothing. She had gambled, thinking she could neglect me, discard me, and still somehow profit from our past. She had lost, and she had no one to blame but herself. It had been over 2 years since I walked out, taking Elijah with me, leaving that chapter behind. And during all that time, Peggy had never made an effort to contact me. She moved on, and so did I. I wouldn't say I was fully healed, but I had stopped expecting an apology that would never come. I had come to terms with it. Closure wasn't something I would ever receive. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when I saw her name appear on the screen. Peggy. I had no idea why I hadn't erased her number. For a moment, I just stared at it. My hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether I should pick up or let it go to voicemail. What could she possibly want now? But deep down, I already knew. People like Peggy only call when they need something. After a brief hesitation, I answered. Stephen. Her voice was different. The usual arrogance was absent, and there was no trace of her former indifference. What I heard was uncertainty. I stayed silent, waiting. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, as if she wasn't sure whether I'd listen or hang up right away. I was selfish, she continued, almost in a whisper. I thought you'd always be there. I never believed you would actually leave. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. There it was. The realization, too late to matter. Then, after a long silence, came what I had known would come. I miss you. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just an empty void. I exhaled, my voice calm and distant. Do you miss me, or do you miss the fact that I loved you even when you didn't deserve it? The silence that followed said everything. Stephen, please. But I was done. I wasn't that man anymore, the one who waited, the one who hoped, the one who allowed himself to be forgotten in his own life. Peggy, I hope you find peace. But I'm not coming back. I ended the call, and in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt completely free. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. Abigail and I had shared nearly a decade as a couple and marked 10 years of marriage. In the beginning, everything felt right. Or at least, that's what I had convinced myself to believe. We traveled together, laughed until our sides ached, and spent countless nights envisioning the life we would build side by side. But over the last year, an unspoken shift had crept into our world. It wasn't a sudden break, but rather a slow, insidious unraveling that I had ignored until the cracks had already spread too far. Abigail seemed increasingly restless, not necessarily with me, but with life itself. A yearning flickered in her eyes, something beyond our carefully crafted existence, beyond the predictable rhythm we had settled into. What had once been an adventure had become routine in her eyes. I struggled to understand why stability, something we had both worked so hard to achieve, had turned into a cage for her. We had built a life of security, free from financial worries, wrapped in comfort. I had poured myself into my sales job to ensure we had everything: an elegant home, financial freedom, the means to enjoy life's pleasures. Yet, none of it seemed to satisfy her. Then there was Ella. From the moment I met her, something about her felt unsettling. She carried an air of disruption, as though she thrived on chaos. Wherever she went, drama followed, and she recounted every scandal with an unsettling enthusiasm. People whispered about her, how infidelity was second nature to her, how she had been the catalyst for the downfall of more than one marriage, and how remorse never seemed to touch her. Abigail, however, dismissed my concerns with a casual wave. "You're being unfair, Simon. She's just fun," she'd say whenever I brought it up. But I couldn't ignore the pattern. Every time I left for a business trip, Ella appeared. Not just once, not twice, every single time. I would return home to the unmistakable signs, an air thick with the scent of alcohol and overpowering perfume, half-drained wine glasses abandoned on the counter, cushions strewn across the living room. Occasionally, I'd find a pair of unfamiliar heels carelessly left by the door. One evening, I finally confronted Abigail. "Why is Ella always here when I'm gone?" She laughed, as if the very idea was absurd. "She keeps me company. Do you not want me to have friends?" Her words cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't about friendship. It was about the company she chose to keep and what she did in my absence. I tried to dismiss my suspicions, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe I was overreacting. But no matter how much I rationalized, the unease never faded. Then came the day I returned from a 3-day business trip to Chicago. Exhausted, I pulled into the driveway, longing for the comfort of home. But relief was fleeting. Outside, the trash bins overflowed, empty liquor bottles, red plastic cups, discarded food trays. It was a stark contrast to Abigail's usual meticulous nature. She never let things pile up like this. Before I could reach the front door, our retired neighbor, Benjamin, called to me from his porch, motioning me over. Benjamin was the type to notice everything. His days were spent tending his lawn with military precision, sipping iced tea, and keeping an eye on the neighborhood. If something happened on our street, he knew about it. "Simon, got a minute?" His voice carried a note of reluctance. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Sure, what's going on?" He hesitated, rubbing his chin as if weighing his words. Finally, he exhaled sharply and spoke. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but "You should know." My pulse quickened. Conversations that started like this rarely led anywhere good. His voice dropped lower. "Your wife had a party while you were gone." My brow furrowed. "What kind of party?" Benjamin shifted uncomfortably. "Lots of people, couples, not just a few, a lot, and this wasn't the first time. It's happened before, every time you've been away." A dull pounding filled my ears. Couples. This wasn't just a casual gathering. This was something else entirely. I forced myself to stay composed. "Are you sure it was my house?" He nodded firmly. "Yeah, Simon. I saw them. Different men, different women. Some I recognized, some I didn't. But they were at your place." None of it made sense. A few friends over? That I could understand. But why would couples be coming and going late at night? I thanked him and made my way inside, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want to answer. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew. The comforting scent of Abigail's vanilla candles was buried beneath the stale stench of alcohol, sweat, and something unplaceable, something illicit, like the remnants of a bar at closing time. The living room was spotless, too clean, as if someone had meticulously erased all evidence of what had transpired. Abigail stood in the kitchen, a wine glass in hand, completely at ease. She looked up and smiled. "Hey, you're back. How was your trip?" I studied her carefully. She seemed normal, too normal. Keeping my voice even, I replied, "It was fine. Long flights, boring meetings." I paused. "And you?" I asked her what she had been doing while I was away. She gave a small shrug, her voice light and indifferent. "Not much. Spent some time with Ella, had dinner, watched a little TV. That's about it. Not a single mention of a party. No reference to having guests over. Just a vague, nondescript account of her evening." My pulse quickened. If there was nothing to conceal, why be so vague? She was hiding something. I needed to know what. That night, after Abigail had drifted off to sleep, I stayed awake, waiting patiently. She always kept her phone beneath her pillow, but she was a light sleeper. I had to be careful. For over an hour I remained motionless, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. When I was certain she was in deep sleep, I carefully slid my hand beneath the pillow and retrieved her phone. My breath caught as I pressed her thumb against the screen, unlocking it. This was my chance. But as I scrolled through her messages, I found nothing. No suspicious texts, no missed calls, no cryptic conversations. Everything was too perfect, almost unnaturally so. I checked her photos. Empty. Social media, scrubbed clean. Even the deleted messages folder had been wiped. She was being methodical, either naturally cautious or deliberately covering her tracks. I returned the phone to its place and lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, tangled in my own suspicion. Something was off, but I had no proof. The next morning, Abigail left the house, likely meeting Ella for brunch or filling her day with whatever she did when she claimed to be bored. As soon as she was gone, I made my move. I ordered a set of discreet, high-resolution cameras and installed them strategically: the living room, the kitchen, and most importantly, our bedroom. I placed them with precision, one hidden between books on a shelf, another tucked near the television, and one concealed behind a decorative plant. If there was something to uncover, these would catch it. Then, I waited. A week later, another business trip approached. I packed my suitcase, slung my laptop bag over my shoulder, and stopped at the front door. "I'll be gone for 3 days," I told her, keys in hand. Her reaction was subdued. No sadness, no concern. I hesitated, watching her recline on the couch, lazily scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my departure. Then, I walked out. At the airport, I pulled into long-term parking and sat for a while, my mind racing. Eventually, I boarded my flight to Dallas. But even as I stepped into another city, my thoughts never left home. Each night, after my meetings ended, I locked myself in my hotel room and opened my laptop. The first night's footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. Abigail moved through her usual routine, watching TV, sipping wine, scrolling through her phone. No visitors, no sign of Ella, no suspicious behavior. Maybe I had let paranoia cloud my judgment. Maybe Benjamin had been wrong. Maybe I was looking for something that didn't exist. Then came the second night. At first, everything appeared normal. Too normal. Abigail and Ella adjusted the lighting, placed candles around the room, and set soft music playing. Then, the alcohol appeared. Bottles of whiskey, vodka, and wine, far more than 2 people would ever need. Guests began to arrive. Not just a couple of friends, but multiple couples. Some I recognized, neighbors I had only exchanged passing greetings with. Others were complete strangers. My heartbeat thundered as I leaned closer to the screen. The living room filled with people. Conversations intermingled with laughter, whispers, and lingering touches. Glasses were refilled, bodies edged closer together. Women perched on the laps of men they hadn't arrived with, murmuring into their ears. Some swayed to the music, their movements far too intimate to be platonic. Then, realization hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just a casual gathering. This was a swingers party. My stomach twisted into knots. My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It felt like watching a nightmare unfold, one I was never meant to witness. And there she was, Abigail, my wife, smiling, twirling her hair, flirting. At first, she chatted with a man I didn't recognize, a tall, muscular stranger. Then, before I could fully comprehend what was happening, she leaned in and kissed him. Then another. My fists tightened. What the hell was I watching? Ella leaned in, whispered something to Abigail, and they both giggled. Moments later, Abigail took the man's hand and led him upstairs. My grip on the laptop intensified, my fingers aching from the pressure. Upstairs. Our bedroom. Our bed. I felt sick. I could have slammed the laptop shut right then and there, could have spared myself from witnessing any more. But I couldn't look away. I needed to see how deep this betrayal went. With shaking hands, I fast-forwarded through the footage. More couples vanished into separate rooms. Others remained in the living room, their interactions escalating beyond any innocent pretense. And I watched, helpless, shattered. One by one they vanished down the hallway, swallowed by the darkness of the night. And at the heart of it all stood Abigail, drinking, laughing, betraying me as if I were nothing more than a fleeting thought. My fists tightened at my sides, my jaw clenched so hard I felt the strain, but I remained motionless. Not yet. I wore the mask of indifference, pretending I hadn't just watched my world crumble. Inside, however, a fire raged. That was the moment I decided. As we sat at breakfast the next morning, bathed in the quiet light of dawn, I casually introduced the idea of another work trip. 3 days in New York, I murmured, sipping my coffee as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. She barely glanced up from her phone, her interest as faint as a passing breeze. "All right," she muttered absent-mindedly. "When do you leave?" she asked, her eyes still glued to the screen. I forced a casual smile. "Tomorrow morning." No pause, no sadness, not a flicker of hesitation, just a brief nod before she returned to scrolling. That was all I needed to confirm. She already had plans, only this time I wasn't leaving. Instead, I checked into a hotel across town and waited. That evening, with my laptop open, I accessed the hidden cameras I had installed. Just as before, they arrived, one after another. They walked in without a care, laughing like they owned the place, their arms laden with expensive liquor. This wasn't a one-time betrayal, it was a ritual. Among them was Ella, Abigail's closest friend and chief enabler, immediately draping herself over some man, whispering in his ear before even stepping inside. And Abigail? She was the center of it all, flirting, pouring drinks, acting as if none of this carried consequences, as if she weren't destroying everything we had built together. This wasn't mere infidelity. She was orchestrating the entire thing. Disgust twisted in my gut. I wouldn't just sit by and watch. I would end it. So I waited for the perfect moment. The party hit its peak. Music pulsed through the walls, alcohol flowed freely, and people were already vanishing into hidden corners. That's when I moved. As I pulled up to the house, it was barely recognizable. Cars cluttered the driveway, even spilling onto the neighbors' lawns. My home, my refuge, had been turned into a reckless playground for strangers. I stepped out of my car, strode up the walkway, and shoved the front door open. A wall of noise crashed into me, pounding bass, the sharp tang of alcohol, the thick blend of sweat and perfume. My eyes scanned the chaos. Strangers, everywhere. Some tangled together on the couch, others whispering in shadowed corners, slipping away into darkened rooms. A couple froze on the staircase when they saw me, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They didn't even recognize me. That only fueled my fury. I pushed through the crowd, searching for Abigail. She was nowhere in sight, until I heard her voice, from upstairs, from our bedroom. I pulled out my phone, started recording, and climbed the stairs. The muffled sounds behind the door became clearer with each step. It was slightly ajar, faint shadows shifting beyond the frame. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the door wide open. There she was, Abigail, my wife, in our bed, with another man. At first, she didn't even notice me, too consumed by her deception. But the moment I spoke, she froze. "Enjoying yourself?" Her body stiffened. The man beneath her twisted around, his face shifting from pleasure to sheer panic as he scrambled for the sheets. "What the—" he stammered, clawing for anything to cover himself. Abigail turned to me, her face draining of all color. Her lips parted, but no words came. I raised my phone higher. "Smile, Lindsay. You're on camera." She yanked the sheets over herself, her voice shaking. "Simon? I—" A bitter, hollow laugh escaped me. "Oh, I'm sure you've got an excuse, but save it. I already know everything. I saw it all." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "Please, Simon, just let me—" I snapped. "I trusted you. I loved you. And this? This is what you do while I'm gone?" The man, still fumbling with his clothes, raised his hands in surrender. "Dude, I swear, I didn't know she was married." I turned to him, my voice sharp as a blade. "I don't care! Get out!" He didn't wait for a second warning. Grabbing his clothes, he bolted past me. Abigail crumbled into sobs. "Simon, please, we need to talk." I shook my head. "Oh, we'll talk. In court." Her sobs turned frantic. "No. No. Please don't do this. I'm filing for divorce," I said coldly, "and I won't let you take another thing from me." She reached out, hands trembling. "Baby, please." I stepped back. "You're not my wife anymore." Then I turned and walked away, leaving her drowning in the wreckage she had created. The divorce was ruthless. She begged, she pleaded, she tried every trick, tears, apologies, empty promises, but I was finished. I packed my life into boxes, sold the house, and cut all ties. She walked away with nothing. No home, no money, not a cent. Before I disappeared from her life entirely, I made sure her parents saw the truth. I sent them the videos. They needed to know what their daughter had become. Last I heard, she was still with Ella, still partying, still losing everything. And me? I'm free, and I've never been happier. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.